waters. Well, I'm live, it seems. And you know what I don't have? I don't have a glass of water. So I'm going to grab that while people show up. Enjoy yourselves. Looks like there's a few people here so far. Love to know who read the book. So, if you could let me know when you come in, or who has read the book, what we're looking at in terms of who's here and what they'll be able to share, that would be good. Interestingly enough, I just want to have a little bit of housekeeping stuff with the stream I have here. I've been trying to figure out how to share images from my software, and I've just been having a lot of difficulties getting them to show correctly. So even though I have this image of the cover of the book, I don't know that I'm going to be able to share some of the engravings like I would like to. So I may flip through the book to just kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. Hello, Cecilia. Hello, Maria. Glad you're here. I always feel so strange at the beginning of live streams because it's like, okay, let's wait for some people to get here before you start talking. And I know I can't wait for too long, but it always seems kind of silly to just talk to like 3 or 4 people, given how like big they can get. But yeah, thank you all for showing up and being here. Hi, Merritt. Good to see you here. I'm going to set this down now. Well, we have 4 viewers, so I guess let's get started, right? You snooze, you lose. The book we're discussing today is Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. And the title says Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation. One of the reasons why I wanted to read this book was because of how intertwined I think these subject matters are, and how big a part of women's history is lost when we don't discuss kind of what has happened to us as a people. And also how it relates to the social order in general. So I wanted to look at something that was going to give kind of a better historical context and more of a class analysis for my viewers. Because one thing that I've noticed that's really lacking in most, I think, feminist circles and in most discussions is a understanding of how society is ordered. And so when you talk about like women as a class, you have to understand what exactly that means. And specifically, I think Silvia Federici with this book really breaks down how women's bodies have been turned into a form of, well, women's bodies are treated as a resource, essentially. And this is part of why, you know, it is very important to maintain a definition of woman that understands us as a resource physically, because without that protection, etc., legally speaking, we are subjected to just sexist restrictions put on us from without. So I wanted to kind of look at something that would demonstrate exactly how the female body is utilized by the society in general, by males, and also by like the ruling classes to maintain the social order, and why resisting the extrapolation of our physical resources, meaning our reproductive labor power, is such an important act. And also an understanding of how the way we live isn't necessarily the way things have to be as well. So part of that is we are indoctrinated just in the educational system into looking at our reality through the eyes of the ruling classes. And this means that we're taught to see the social order as natural, and the specific social order, meaning the economy, meaning how we live day to day, our relationship arrangements, etc. These are all orchestrated by basically the ruling elites to create a system that perpetuates itself. So anyway, let's kind of talk about some of the ideas in the book, because I'm just kind of going into this probably boring look at like why I wanted to read it and why I thought it would be important for us to talk about. The ideas that she shares in the book, and specifically the concept around primitive accumulation and its relationship to like the human body and to women. If anyone is not familiar with what primitive accumulation is, I have a good definition, which I took from the Marxist Internet Archive. It is the process by which pre-capitalist modes of production, such as feudalism and chattel slavery, are transformed into the capitalist mode of production. So she starts out kind of talking about the class antagonisms that existed in Europe. Very early on, and how the peasantry interacted with the landowning classes and the kind of antagonisms that were happening there. She discusses various rebellions, one of the most famous being the Peasants' Rebellion in England. There's a bunch of like interesting history around that, and when I was in London, that was like my favorite aspect of going to some of the museums was seeing some of that history documented from the medieval times, because after the situation of the Black Death or the plague in Europe, the population was made incredibly small. And this meant that there weren't many workers, essentially, to be on the lands. And the nobility started to be, they started to not be able to exploit people like they could before. Peasants were able to move around more freely. There were new laws kind of made around like the way they could dress. I mean, you have to understand there were all of these incredibly weird rules about what people could wear, how they could intermingle, what their lives could look like. And at a point after like all of this death that had wiped out a great number of the population, the labor power of the peasantry became incredibly valuable. And it kind of made me think, I just want to put this idea out there about how essential it is to the ruling classes that people breed. It is so drilled into workers specifically now, but of the past as well. And I mean, this is even in the Bible, that you're supposed to go be fruitful and multiply across the lands, right? It is a very good it's beneficial to the bourgeoisie, the capitalist classes, that there be a large number of surplus workers. Because workers, proletarian people who exist on the free market as those who sell their labor power and can only really have our labor power to sell. If we're competing with one another for jobs and for resources, then we aren't going to be able to, well, it keeps us locked into a state essentially of a lack of freedom. And even now, I mean, the social stratification that we're witnessing now, coupled with extreme like population booms, is really looking very badly in terms of people's lifestyles. There's a direct correlation between these things. And a lot of leftists don't want to look at this, but the reality is that people don't naturally breed this much. This is an unnatural kind of viral thing that's happening with humans. So I could go all over with the ideas, but she talks about, how the ways in which people were living at this time were actually very progressive in a lot of ways, that we would see them as such. And the reality is too that like with this lack of peasantry in Europe, there was a lot more power for female peasants as well, just because, again, the labor became more valuable. So she talks about, I don't want to jump around too much, and I have some interesting notes too, like to get into, because this book, I just want to say, I guess before I kind of continue on, that this book really helps me put a lot of puzzle pieces together. Like, these were ideas that I had like little bits and pieces of, this happened, like little pieces of history. She really strings it all together in a way that you can understand what was actually going on and how it was done. And I think too, she really shows that like what we call in modern day the burning times, the witch hunts, these were part of a orchestrated move by the ruling classes to create social hegemony, to create order, and to adjust people to transform them from like peasants into proletarians. This was how it was done. And the thing is, too, it had to be done through a great level of violence and death and really fear and being inflicted on people. Because even if you weren't a victim of these heinous crimes that were committed all over the place, the sheer knowledge of it happening really would badly affect you. You know, it's the social trauma. I think too, like, anyway, there's a lot of ideas in here that just really kind of come together into a full picture that before was just not making much sense to me. I didn't want to say it wasn't making much sense to me, but like I didn't have all of the pieces, and this book really gave me all of the pieces. So she talks about, okay, so the crushing of the peasants, a lot of this was done through these reigns of terror, essentially. They started with the heretics. So there are many different times and places around Europe where people's beliefs were deemed heretical, and the church aligned with like the state powers, you know, or in places where it was the state, you know, essentially eliminated anyone who was a threat to their power. And oftentimes she demonstrates that women were drawn to these heretical movements. I mean, what is a heretic? Essentially, it's somebody who, you know, oftentimes people who were reading doctrine on their own, so they were like interpreting the Bible for themselves, that was considered to be heresy, and you could be killed for that. You know, women going around preaching about the Bible or preaching about like the ideas contained therein, or expressing ideas that were contrary to the church at the time. I think too we have to look at the social order, or the social morals, I should say, because we're often like given this impression that society progresses over time and gets more and more liberal, more and more tolerant. And it's not exactly the case. You know, there were many times in medieval Europe and many places that would be considered to be on par in terms of like essentially what kind of behaviors were tolerated with more modern eras. And, you know, even compared to like some nations now, like quite progressive. So you have to understand that like and she really demonstrates like the laws that were put in place, the methods by which the church and the state came together essentially to divide and conquer is how I would put it. And that's kind of what the whole witch hunt thing was about, essentially. It was about creating a great division between the people who would become proletarians. You know, if you want to control people, the number one method that you do it by is through getting them to fight amongst themselves, and getting them to be divided amongst themselves. And this is a problem we're still facing today. You know, when we talk about witch hunts and we talk about like just controlled opposition is a good way of putting it. It's of interest that people of the same class be divided amongst one another. It's of interest to capital for these things to happen. So, instead of looking at who's polluting the earth or like what companies are doing or what exploitation is going on, what sort of ways that capital uses like the state apparatus to consolidate its power, how all of these different, I feel like I'm not expressing this clearly enough, but all of these ways in which basically the ruling elites maintain their power, it's through getting those of us who have essentially the same relationship to the economy, meaning like, for example, the proletarians who sell their labor power on the free market. We should be, in solidarity with one another. We have similar interests, like globally speaking. However, we are taught to identify with the values of the ruling classes. And this is like why I get so frustrated with listening to people talk about like electoral politics and like right versus left, elections, these things. What ends up happening a lot of the time is people become divided on issues that aren't really related to what their specific interests are. And you'll find that people are fighting amongst themselves, essentially, and not really seeing the big picture of who's running things and what they're doing. So this was a problem in medieval Europe as well. So I kind of jumped around a bit. I'm probably going to be doing that through this live stream. I just realized I don't think there's a way to with this book, because every time I talk about something, I get kind of caught back and forward. So let's talk about kind of what was happening in the creation of capital. One of the main things that happened was the privatization of the common lands. So peasants, historically, like we talk about feudalism, peasants were people who lived on land, worked it for part of the year, and had their own kind of homes and that sort of thing the rest of the year. Peasants actually worked a great deal less than modern humans. I'm just thinking right now, it's winter in the Northern Hemisphere, or it's about to be, I should say. You would not have seen peasants working much this time of year in most places in Europe. This would be time that they were like off because it wasn't time to, the land was not being utilized at this point. The other things about peasants, they often had animals that they kept. And comparatively to what kind of happened after this point, peasants had a degree of freedom that modern humans lack. And when I say this, I mean they had more time to themselves. And honestly, if you look at all of the work that needs to happen versus the work that people do, it's an utterly insane model that we're living under, to have people getting up like out of rhythm with the earth and with the seasons and working the same shifts every day. It's not necessary. The other things about it, maybe I'm just going to go on a rant about what all is wrong with capitalism, honestly, but the order of things is out of alignment with the natural order of the world. And as such, human beings had to be forced into these ways of being. It was not done easily. So yeah, the privatization of the commons. Common lands were ones that, anyone had access to. They were not owned by any nobility. They were like forests, they were lakes, rivers, streams. They were places where people could go and live, off of the bounty of the natural land. You could go into the forest and collect wood if you were a peasant. You could, there were sometimes rules around what kind of animals you could hunt. Sometimes, like, only certain animals were allowed to be hunted by nobility, but for the most part, like, these spaces were very important to maintaining the feudal way of life for peasants. They had the ability to work for part of the year. That way they could stay on the lands they were on, essentially. And then they had the ability to go the rest of the time and provide for themselves. So this is the other thing about that way of life. People had a great deal of personal freedom, that just by having free time, they had personal freedom and they had an ability to have personal responsibility as well. So these things were very important to the people. And they did not, many of them did not want to give them up. So in comes these horrible sorts of inquisitions that destroyed communities through senseless acts of violence. Let's kind of talk about, so we talked about the heretics. Women were often leading the heretical movements. The heretics were kind of a precursor to the witches as well, and so I'm glad that she included that as part of the history here, because if we look at that, that was a great bloodshed that also happened, and the heretics were often accused of being in cahoots with the devil, etc. Now I'm kind of thinking about wanting to look at some of the images in this book. So anyway, let's see, what's else in my note? So the destruction of the commons was a serious issue for the people. And so once these laws started being passed that removed people from their ability to utilize the lands, there was a lot of resistance against this, and people did take up resistance against it. If fences were erected, people took them down, destroyed them. And this is kind of where you get the start of these like whispers around, witches going to sabbats in the night. So these people who were essentially conspiring against the property owning classes, right, for removing them from their common lands and their right to utilize the common lands, they started to kind of take on this, the phenomenon became this kind of thing where they were, instead of like being seen as like the revolutionaries that they were, I guess, they became witches, right? Their conspiracies to maintain the social order that had sustained them became evidence of their consorting with the devil. So you see like a person going in the nighttime, maybe to meet with other people to plan a rebellion, could very easily get labeled a witch. And overwhelmingly, the people who were labeled witches were women. Specifically, I think it's very good that she, in this book, talked about how this impacted older women specifically. Older women resisted very strongly the changes. And I think this is something that has continued into our culture in modern days. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times where I've seen women dismissed solely based on their age. I don't see men dismissed in the same ways. And this is kind of the problem with ageism and like having intergenerational strife. I think it's very important to understand that people who have lived through and seen shit go down for decades tend to be a little more savvy about, you know, what the elites are doing. I mean, not necessarily, but if they've been like active, you know, in their life, witnessing these things go down and resisting them, it's a real problem that younger people, specifically radicals, are taught to diminish and silence them. This has its roots in the witch hunts. I mean, another thing that was happening at the same time and how they were determining who was a witch and who wasn't, I mean, the laws changed. She includes a lot of the laws around prostitution, rape, etc., because these things had an impact on women. One of the greatly, like in terms of our social status. One of the things that I thought was important that she shared was how prostitutes were viewed in Europe. A lot of the times, prostitutes would be essentially hired by a man, not just for sexual services, but they were like doing all of these other tasks for him. So the relationship between prostitute and wife, I mean, when you look at the history here, they're not dissimilar. Men could hire a prostitute to basically do all of these tasks that a wife would do, like cleaning, cooking for him, etc. And this was prevalent in different military conquests as well. The men in the military would often have their prostitutes go with them to, you know, take care of these things that needed to be done. So it wasn't necessarily like the shameful thing that it later became. Part of the whole way in which this concept of witches was invented by these people was to really criminalize female sexuality itself. So female sexuality outside of reproduction became a serious problem. Women who engaged in it past menopause were, they became like sources of derision and disgust. The other thing that's too with that, there was a great proliferation of pornography around Europe that was helping fuel these kinds of hunts on women. And I think that's another thing that's really not recognized. Let me just show you an example. For goodness sakes. There are many like engravings and images circulated that portrayed older women's bodies nude and in kind of a degraded manner. For goodness sakes. I have them on my computer, but I can't get it. There's specifically one image I'm looking for, so I'm sorry. This is taking a moment. I just saw an image of ducking. So yeah, I mean, women were basically being tortured in public, and Oh my goodness. And there we go. Okay, so here's an example. This is from 1510. It's an image of the witches having a Sabbath. Let me make sure this is coming up correctly. So they're all nude and they're much older women. So their bodies, you see kind of the effects of like age on the skin, the sagging, the kind of, roundness that women's bodies take on over time. And they're portrayed as really like wanton and lustful, and they're feasting on babies. Very, very wicked pornographic images of women. I mean, that's just one example, but these things were disseminated. And I think that's another aspect of how these women were dehumanized, which was to turn them into like wanton, lustful sexual objects. So, and specifically outside of the confines of reproduction as well. So this is significant, this procreation, or not procreation, but this sexuality outside of reproduction became criminalized around the same time. She also talked about rape and how it was legalized against women of lower classes, or again, so you could rape basically peasant women, and men could come in and do that. This was another part of how they created this extra antagonism between like male and female peasants to create the modern proletariat. So if a woman was raped, at this time, chances are that she would end up like in prostitution, because the social order was so extreme that there was no way to like essentially come back from that. This situation was basically that you were considered to be a ruined woman. So the legalization of rape like really put on a whole other like added just division that had really long lasting consequences. So yeah, prostitution, prostitutes, older women, specifically women who lived outside of like male relationships as well, older women who maybe, were not attached to any family or who hadn't bred, like these women all became victims of suspicion, and they were considered to be elements that needed to be removed from society. So yeah, you just see like the way in which this campaign of terror was orchestrated against the people in order to facilitate the mechanization of society. So she like details also the mechanization of the human body. So around this time, women also, I want to say this too, women were also criminalized from practicing medicine and doing a lot of like the midwives specifically as well began to have a lot of restrictions put on the work they could do. And this meant that a lot of jobs that specifically had been done by women became like male jobs as well. So this was another way in which males extrapolated power and public what am I trying to say? Women became not able to interact in public life in the same way. So yeah, this is all very, very much intertwined, you know, the demonization of the witches, the privatization of the commons, the hyperstratification of the society is all coming together to create the current social order. I mean, and when you look at the criminalization of sexuality outside of, you know, reproductive, marriageable, you know, reproduction in that context, like, it really was about exploiting women's bodies as much as possible. So, where do I want to go next with this? Yeah, this removed women from public life. So women who had jobs, were working, doing things in their communities. It became harder and harder to support yourself as a woman as well. And then also they also were enacting laws as well that were around what you could pay women versus men, and women obviously made much less. I mean, all of these things were specifically enacted, and I'm really grateful that she has such extensive notes in this book about where she gets her information from, and all the different places that she was putting these pieces together. So this is all about, I mean, the creation of the modern family, if you will. And this is another thing about, I think the society we live in now. The family is an institution that privatizes and really removes us from understanding the social arrangements that we're living under, because there's a lot of sentiment, and these are the closest relationships that people are meant to have. You know, even under the different times of feudalism, people wanted to do away with the lords that own the land. So this was something as well that I think they were hyper conscious of, you know, they needed to divide the people in order to maintain control. So there's another image I wanted to show you that's kind of about the mechanization of the body, what she talked about in this book. So there's this image that shows the human body as a machine, which is kind of ties into the ideology that they were trying to enforce at the time, and that we still are living under, that the body is this machine that can be programmed essentially to do whatever the ruling classes want, you know, however they can extrapolate our labor power. And so we should probably talk about labor power a little bit, because it's this, well, as I said before, it is the thing that we sell. You know, most of us watching this anyway, it's the thing that we sell on the market. It's the only thing we have to sell. And being in this state where that is all we have to sell, that's something that's obscured from our eyes a lot of the time. We're not even taught to think about what we're doing when we go and get a job. Essentially, that you'll be selling your labor to a capitalist who will then extrapolate profit off of it, period, for a fee. a fee that doesn't even cover the value of what your labor power is worth. Next to that image of the mechanical man. So, this is about, again, modern agriculture, modern ways of doing things, how they were intending to get people to see their bodies as machines so that you would feel natural getting up, hours before the sun is out, and you would feel natural working in the darkest hours. There's this image of the human body as a part of nature, as a tree here. It's getting backwards here. So yeah, this is the two kind of opposing ideologies there. I also want to address, she talks about there are different people were targeted by the witch hunts. Okay, so heretics we mentioned, older women who basically, beggars, poor people, poor older women were consistently who were seen as menaces because they begged from their neighbors, or they, caused them problems because the social order had changed and they're trying to make a living and not being able to anymore because of the privatization of the common lands that they would have been able to live off of for centuries. This whole change in the social order, dispossessed a lot of people. And I mean, you can see it too now. There's a lot of, in the US specifically, and in other industrialized nations, a great deal of people who are marginal and homeless. And they are often treated with derision. They're subject to fear. There's, a great idea of what are we going to do with all these people? I want you to imagine a more primitive time where you have people kind of in similar circumstances where, they're not able to provide for themselves like they could before and are then being scapegoated for all of these horrendous situations, all of these just bizarre made up things. That's the real thing that I want you to just imagine that happening now. Imagine just, let's say, the local homeless population being accused of eating babies, of fornicating with the devil, of killing people's children by looking at them wrong, of cursing people. Magic too, it's often said when we look and talk about as well the way when we do get any sort of information from mainstream historical sources with the witch trials and witch hunts, it's often portrayed like this was, just people who were ignorant, who didn't know what they were doing, who were superstitious. And it's no, in most of human history, this wasn't happening, okay? People weren't accusing their neighbors of such things, or they weren't accusing the poor and dispossessed of these things. This was something that was orchestrated from above by most educated, most enlightened people. And then it was enacted, and caught on, because it was effective, ridding society of undesirable people who were inconvenient to the social order that was being enacted. So, okay, the other thing that I really enjoyed about this book was how she dealt with this subject in the Americas. And that's another thing that we are not taught about. When I learned about witch trials and witch hunts in the US, the biggest case that you hear about is Salem. And she does touch on Salem briefly, but the main witch hunts that were happening here in the Americas were against the indigenous population. And I want to share some images too that she had of that. The images that were circulating Europe, at the same time, or, of the indigenous people, portrayed them in the same ways that witches were being portrayed in Europe. So here's some witches, right? Doing their bad things. And then you have some Aboriginal Americans, right, the indigenous people of these lands, being portrayed as cannibals as well. So they both, interestingly enough, both groups were accused of cannibalism, right? And, while cannibalism may have happened in certain contexts, this is a way of dehumanizing and justifying the crimes that were being committed against these people. Okay, just like with the witches in Europe, a similar campaign of propaganda was enacted against the people from these lands who were, being expropriated from their own lands. And the other thing is too, women resisted they've resisted invasion. Women have always been big resistors of these type of changes, just historically speaking, but in the Americas specifically, a lot of these things. So yeah, you have witches in Europe and then the indigenous people, Oh, and the other thing is they always portrayed them as nude, Very rarely would these images have the people in clothes, which I think is also about stripping them of dignity. There was another image in here where the indigenous Americans are portrayed as devils. Yeah. So even though these people didn't know who the fucking devil was, right, didn't have any sort of context of Christianity, they were in cahoots with him, and America was considered the land of the devil, right? So I don't know if I wish I could share this. Let me see if I can get, because that's just not bringing forth what I want to show you. Yeah, okay, here's an image. All right. Well, that's not what I wanted. What in the heck? I swear I'm going to figure this out somehow, y'all. Okay. I don't seem to be able to rotate it either. What the heck? Anyway. The people were portrayed essentially as devils. So this is another way that the use, again, the nudity, portraying of people as primitive, essentially. This is a way of dehumanizing them and making them seem more devilish and more immoral, and thus helping to justify, I think, the rape, murder, and annihilation of large swaths of people in both lands. They also, she also touches on how in the American colonies, because many white indentured servants, being European descent indentured servants, came to the different colonies. Many of them ended up either, running away to live amongst the indigenous peoples or intermarrying with indigenous peoples or even enslaved Africans. So this was also something that these kind of, she also touches on the laws that were put in place to stop these sorts of things from happening, how it was done, and how just orchestrated it was, because again, it's the same, divide and conquer. And that's what the whole witch thing is about. It's just essentially divide and conquer. Make a group of people the scapegoat, essentially, for all of the ills of a society, right? All of these terrors that people have, and all these worries, and justify essentially the annihilation of them. So let's see. Wadamote says what was the symbolic significance of cannibalism that made the accusation so damning back then? Does anyone know? Was it just scary or was there a deeper meaning? I mean, I think like cannibalism is the ultimate taboo, right? It's almost universal that cannibalism is seen as something that is, an abomination. I don't know how else to put it. Most of Europeans would have seen it as such. And, the thing is too, a lot of people in Europe were starving. And so cannibalism did happen, at different points because of the privatization of the land. So the cannibalism is it's about I think essentially treating people as if they have no sort of ethical or moral or even because it's this ultimate taboo. If you break it, essentially you are subhuman somehow, or you're animalistic. You're not it's a way of portraying people as I think it's a way of portraying them as just not safe. I mean, if you're hunting and killing people, I mean, what could happen, right? Which is the acts of cannibalism that did take place in the Americas, we also have to understand that these were often tied to religious sorts of rites. And even the fucking Christian religion is cannibalistic. You're eating Jesus's flesh and drinking his blood when you take communion. It's a so there's cannibalism is it's just this taboo. So I think that's what this is how I kind of interpret it. Let's see. Yeah, you can't trust anybody who might eat you, right? That's very simple. I mean, don't you fear cannibals? I mean, I would be if I knew that one of my neighbors was a cannibal, I'd be probably a little disturbed by that. I don't know, even with this enlightened perspective about it, it's definitely a way of creating division, and so then people aren't going to identify right with the people in these lands who were being basically turned into slave labor, mass tortured, killed, all of these things. It's a way of breaking identification. If you demonize people who have similar class interests to you by making them seem completely unnatural to you, their ways of being completely unnatural to you, you're not going to identify with them. It was a propaganda campaign. I think also this is I mentioned the pornographic aspect of these images that were circulating. The cannibals, not only were they naked in these images, just the witch images as well, they were, and many of the witch images showed cannibalism taking place. And this is the other thing, this was about also how they criminalized practices that were pretty normal in Europe, like abortion practices. They portrayed the midwives and women who engaged in these practices as killing babies, giving babies to the devil, eating babies, these kind of really devious things. So, if a woman had, let's say, administered an abortion on another woman and it came to light, she could be accused of all manner of these things, one of my favorite two things with the witches is how men like accuse them of taking penises. And I remember seeing, not in this book specifically, but I remember seeing an engraving where there was like a witch who had a ton of dicks in a tree, like she was hiding them in nests, birds' nests. Like it's such bizarre, wild fantasy like that. It's boggles the mind, you know, because people, it's hard to believe that people believe these things, but if you like repeat a lie often enough, it becomes believed. I mean, we've seen this time and time again. You just say something, repeat something that's not true enough times, and people will start to believe it. So, yeah. What else did I want to talk about with this book? I'm looking at my notes right now. You know, I realized talking about it today and kind of how I've stuttered and moved around, a lot of this stuff is kind of disturbing to talk about. It's somewhat like, when you think about it, it's rather traumatizing to think about as well, how just the statistics alone, some towns had so many women killed. There were also men accused of witchcraft and killed, but overwhelmingly, like, I think she said something like over 80% of those accused and murdered as witches were women. And so that's very significant here. Women are seen, I think this is just natural, and I think this is something that we have to understand about ourselves. Women are generally more radical than men. Women generally are more willing to engage in like seditious acts, and also are more we just have a natural connection to our land bases, because of the ways in which our bodies are treated like a resource and extrapolated from. So capital, in order to create modern capitalism, you know, bodies had to be turned into machines. Humans had to be regimented. Our lives had to be ordered very to function, essentially, to reproduce the system. And this is kind of how we live now as well. The whole concept of what we're taught to aspire to, the ways we're taught to have relationships, the ways in which we're taught to have a family, etc. These expectations are really about reproducing the next generation of proletarian workers. And if women have control essentially over our bodies, they cannot be extrapolating essentially the next generation from us. The female body became this machine that was used to churn out workers. And as the populations began to rise again, this was really beneficial. As I said, you know, people in competition with one another for resources. It helps breed conformity. It helps create a social order where people are afraid to speak out, where people go along with things that maybe they don't even agree to. One interesting thing too, she included this case of, she said there was one case where this town, I think it was in France, most of the men were fishermen and they were out like working. And they got news that as they were gone, like their wives, a lot of them back in, you know, the town they lived in had been accused of witchcraft. And this was like one case where like men came and like rescued women. But all in all, overwhelmingly, men were allowing these things to go on. And it was a good way, it was a way for men to get away with shit as well. So like if a man had like sexually assaulted a woman, you know, he could accuse her of witchcraft. And the thing is too about the whole witchcraft thing, once you're accused of it, there was no way to like, you had, how do you disprove it, right? It was something that was just assumed, and then you would be put under torture essentially until you confessed, or are subjected to like all manner of like fucked up practices like the ducking, all of these things were ways that men could basically get away scot-free with like harming women. You know, let's say a man, you know, impregnated a woman out of wedlock, it would be a way to like get rid of her. And this happened to a lot of women, and I think it's important to really kind of consider the fact that like while this was going on, men really sold out like women, like other proletariats. They're the people of a similar class to them, you know, for, you know, very, very meager privileges over us. So this is, you know, this is something I think to keep in mind, how easily people are bought off, how easily, like when these methods of social control are enacted, how easily people can go along with them. She also talked about modern witch hunts, and it seems to be like the case that anytime a community is being subjected to primitive accumulation, meaning that like resources are getting consolidated by certain people to like, you know, basically enforce capitalism on people, there seems to be a rise in witch accusations, and this happens all over the world. It's a phenomenon that's really tied to the creation of capital, because getting people to, you know, we're taught that like, it's so interesting how like backwards people are and how we think about things are, you know, and what we consider abundance to be, you know, outside of the context of interaction with this culture, people don't know they're poor, okay? People don't know that their like lifestyle is not up to par a lot of the time. They have to be taught this, okay? And so I think this is like one of the other lessons that this book teaches us, just how backwards a lot of the beliefs that go into just justifying the global consolidation of capital, like how backwards they really are and how contrary they are to most people's even desires. You know, this way of life had to be imposed. It had to be imposed. So yeah, in the comments section, I see people talking about some of the other works of Federici. I really would be interested to read her book, which is Witch Hunting and Women, as well, which Kitty Cat mentioned. And I do want to kind of wrap this conversation up, so I'd love for people to just like share their thoughts too, kind of if you have anything to say about this book, now's the time. But yeah, I'm going to respond to some of the comments first. Someone said being accused of being a TERF is the new being accused of witchcraft. I think that you could draw parallels to that. Yeah, because again, like, it's a demonization of a whole lot of women over basically, you know, our understanding of ourselves and our bodies. And as I talked about before, like, the whole understanding of women as a sex class, right, relates to our relation in this global order, how our bodies specifically are treated, okay? How we are treated as a result of what our bodies can do, which is reproduce. So, you know, in order to I think, deny women are kind of an understanding of that. It's an understanding of who we are. You know, this whole modern movement has really, not movement, I don't want to call it a movement, it's a phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that's come again from the elites downward, okay? This isn't a grassroots thing that has come about, you know, this is a result of capitalists trying to create new markets to sell to, like, oh, here you go, here's a new way to be an individual, right? Anyway, this is a problem for women. So, you know, women, we understand what we are, we understand who we are, we understand what our bodies do and how it relates to how we're treated. Yeah, I mean, it's a serious problem. If we don't have the language to understand that and to put it into the context, you know, we'll be lost, you know, and then men will again dominate, you know, and I think also, yeah, a great thing, one of the big things that happens with that is it's a way to dehumanize as well. So you call somebody this name, and thus, therefore, anything that she says or does is like suspect, right? Because she's somehow bad because of this heresy she's committed against what is accepted as science. You know, that's the other thing too. A lot of this stuff was happening during like the European Enlightenment, okay? So while all these assholes were circle jerking about how enlightened they were, you know, what was really going on was that, you know, they were consolidating power into the hands of men, consolidating knowledge, which is power, into the hands of men, and turning women into completely like second-class citizens. Not even citizens. I mean, in many places, women didn't even have the rights of that. So, yeah, I think it is important to like look at that, because TERF is an example now of how this phenomenon is playing out, divide and conquer. You know, if a woman gets labeled that, it makes it harder for her to like it makes it harder to have connections, you know, which is another thing why it's so important, I think, to be out specifically, because I often see it said that, like, you know, our opinions, right, everyone thinks this, or most people think this. It's like, if that is the case, then why aren't more women out? You know, why aren't more women speaking up? And it's like, again, that fear of social ostracization that's going on. That's a real controlling factor. Of course, we're not subjected to the same level, I think, of state terror. And I think that's important. But yeah, this way of like dehumanizing the other. Okay, you know, dehumanize the other, pornograph. You know, the other thing too, and I see, and I've had to in the past year really unfollow a lot of people who share kind of stuff related to this because it's not good. I don't want to take poison, you know, I don't want to see it. I don't want to read it or be subjected to it. A lot of women share a lot of the pornographic ways that men describe women who understand the difference between men and women, i.e. TERFs, right? There's a lot of pornographic writings and idealization and fetishization being enacted specifically on social media, where men just write their like disturbing fantasies of either like how they'd like to treat women like this, or like this is specifically, I think, how men have been taught, and you know, not just been taught, but like it goes back to this time. Like women are consistently reduced to being sexual objects, regardless of whether, you know, we want to be or not. So that is like specifically, I think, also one aspect of being like a sex class. And that kind of is also tied in with this book. I really think she really makes it clear that it's a result of like our bodies and what they do, that, you know, has been the method by which we're controlled. So I really appreciated that in this book as well. But I mean, I agree with a lot of what people are saying. You know, it's really important, I think, when we are engaging as human beings to look for these kind of methods of dividing and conquering and to challenge them. And also, I think, to not, but also I wouldn't like, don't let the accusation, right, stop you from speaking your mind or like speaking the truth about these things, because it's just, it's necessary to. And we aren't living in, well, we're not being subjected to the same terror is what I'm saying, but you see the echoes of it is what I'm trying to get at. That like there are echoes of what was done, how the ideology spread. The other thing too, these like this torture, rape, sexual violation of women during the torture aspects of the witch hunts. You know, this was another way of like turning women into pornography. This is consistent with like dehumanizing women. So that was a real thread that I saw throughout this book. That she didn't really, I mean, she touched on it, I think, once, but it really stood out to me, like that the difference, I guess, of women's bodies becoming this subject of like horror and titillation, you know, and power. One more thing I want to touch on before I go that I thought was interesting. She also talked about how women were punished for basically engaging in the same behaviors that men were. One example was like women being accused of witchcraft for being superstitious, or like having certain days that they would do certain things, which is all tied to astrology. And that was a practice that survived for a long time and thankfully is being resurrected. But you know, in the state, or the like local states, the noblemen, the kings, they all had astrologers. They all had astrologers. They all had alchemists. They all had people performing. They all had men performing magic for them. But because it was being done, I think, by men and for like, you know, the good of like king and country, it was it wasn't considered to be the same thing. Witchcraft was specifically a crime that was being done by the lower classes, you know, and it was also seen as a crime that people did because they were desperate. So like you would cast an evil eye, you know, your neighbor chooses not to give you milk when you're starving, so you like cast an evil eye on them, and all of a sudden their cow dies, right? These sorts of things. So it's interesting too, like some of the male thinkers of the time like were atheists and didn't believe in like any of this stuff, but remained silent about what was happening. I think that's really important to consider. It's very, very important to consider just how the most enlightened folk at the time supposedly had nothing to say about this stuff, had nothing to say about the large numbers of women being murdered, had nothing to say about it, especially if it was all superstition. So yeah, it was about stamping out also like natural practices. Definitely there were cults related to certain like gods and goddesses that hadn't died out in Europe as well, so they went after them. But when you like put it in these contexts, like none of them really measure up. Like some of the women were healers, yes. Some of them were independent women, yes, who like had their own careers and businesses. Yes, that was the case. Some of them were, worshipers of like ancient goddess cults. Yes. But like overall, the real issue was that they and their lifestyle stood in the way of the creation of the modern capitalist society, period. Their independence, their methods, their lifestyles were an affront to those in power, and so they were eliminated. It's a lot to think about. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that like it's all been a discussion that has been edifying for you, and that you got as much from the book as I did. Anyway, I'm going to go now. There's a lot of honking happening outside, of course, and the day must go on. Thank you all for being here and discussing this with me and for reading the book. I haven't decided what we're going to read next. I'm thinking that we might also discuss, or I think we might read something classic. So I'm looking at, I don't know, I'm kind of deciding. So I'll announce on my community post this week what we're going to read next. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you. Goodbye, everyone.